In the quaint village of St. Mary's Mead, the summer fete at Rosewood Manor buzzes with laughter and homemade jams. But a sinister whisper of buried treasure stirs beneath the crimson blooms of the rose arch. An anonymous note, crushed petals, an eerie nighttime tapping draw the curious, yet only Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster with a knack for unravelling secrets, sees through the deception. As villagers chase rumours of Colonel Hargrove's lost fortune, she uncovers a hidden speaker, a secret map, and a web of motives, greed, desperation, and ambition. Who is orchestrating this mystery, and what lies beneath the shed? In a village where every smile hides a secret, Miss Marple's quiet vigilance will reveal the truth before the fate ends. Chapter 1. The summer-fatted sun hung low over St. Mary's Mead, casting a golden glow across the manicured lawns of Rosewood Manor, where the annual summer fete was in full swing. The air hummed with the chatter of villagers, the clatter of crockery, and the distant strains of a local quartet playing a jaunty tune. Stalls laden with jam jars, knitted scarves, and homemade lemonade lined the gravel paths, while children darted through the crowd, their laughter mingling with the scent of blooming roses. At the edge of the scene, beneath the dappled shade of an ancient oak, sat Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles clicking with a steady, almost meditative rhythm. Her pale blue eyes, sharp despite her years, surveyed the bustling fete with a quiet intensity that belied her unassuming appearance. Miss Marple wore a simple tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan, her white hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, content to knit and sip tea while the world spun on. But those who knew her truly knew her, understood that little escaped her notice. She had a way of seeing through the veneer of village life, of spotting the subtle threads of human nature that others overlooked. Today, her attention was drawn not to the stalls or the music, but to a murmur rippling through the crowd, a whisper of something extraordinary, buried treasure. The rumour had begun that morning, when the vicar, Mr. Clement, discovered an anonymous note slipped beneath the door of the rectory. Written in a spidery hand on cheap paper, it spoke of riches hidden somewhere on the manor grounds, guarded by clues that only the discerning could unravel. The note's most tantalizing hint referred to crushed petals below the rose. Arch, a phrase that had set tongues wagging. By noon, the tale had spread like wildfire, transforming the fete into a treasure hunt for eager amateurs. Villagers speculated wildly. Some spoke of gold, others of jewels, and a few whispered of a lost legacy tied to the manor's enigmatic former owner. Colonel Hargrove. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, listened as Mrs. Price, the postmistress, recounted the note's contents to a gaggle of onlookers. "It's true, I tell you," Mrs. Price declared, her voice shrill with excitement. The vicar read it out at the tea tent. "Petals under the rose arch mark, my words, that's where it's hidden." Her audience nodded, eyes bright with greed, though none seemed inclined to investigate just yet. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. She had heard such tales before. Village gossip often spun grand mysteries from the thinnest threads. Yet something about this rumour, its specificity, intrigued her. Why the rose arch? And why now, at the height of the fete? She set her knitting aside and rose, her movements deliberate, and made her way toward the rose arch, a magnificent structure at the garden's heart. Its wooden trellis was draped in crimson roses, their petals vivid against the green vines. A small crowd had already gathered, peering at the ground where a scattering of petals lay, their edges bruised as if trodden underfoot. Miss Marple bent to examine them, her gloved fingers brushing the delicate remains. The damage was not random, she noted. The petals formed a rough circle, as if placed with intent. Most curious, she murmured, straightening up. Her gaze swept the arch, lingering on a faint glint of metal or wire, perhaps. Hidden among the vines nearby, Mrs. Pennyworth, the manor's housekeeper, bustled through the crowd, her apron askew and her face flushed. "Miss Marple," she called, hurrying over. "Have you heard? Treasure, right here, under our noses. Do you think it's real?" Her eyes sparkled with hope, for Rosewood Manor was in dire need of funds, its roof leaking and its walls crumbling. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression kind but guarded. "People will believe anything, Mrs. Pennyworth, if it's told, with enough flair, but I wonder who started this particular story." Her tone was light, but her mind was already at work, sifting through possibilities. The crushed petals, the anonymous note someone was orchestrating this tale, and Miss Marple intended to find out why. As she returned to her seat beneath the oak, her needles resumed their rhythm, but her thoughts were far from idle. The fate carried on, oblivious to the quiet spinster who had already begun to unravel the riddle under the rose arch. Someone, she knew, was watching, waiting for the crowd to take the bait, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human folly, was determined to be one step ahead. Chapter 2. The rose arch Clutha sun had dipped lower in the sky, painting the gardens of Rosewood Manor with a soft amber glow that softened the edges of the bustling summer fete. The crowd had thinned slightly as some villagers drifted toward the tea tent or the homemade preserve stall, but a palpable excitement lingered, fueled by the morning's tantalizing rumor of buried treasure. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender cardigan neatly buttoned and her knitting bag tucked beside her, made her way once more toward the rose arch, the epicenter of the day's intrigue. The structure stood as a crown jewel of the manor's grounds, its sturdy wooden trellis entwined with crimson roses that spilled over in fragrant cascades. The arch framed a gravel path leading deeper into the garden, where manicured hedges and a small fountain created an air of timeless elegance. Yet today it was not the beauty of the roses that drew attention, but the cryptic clue from the anonymous note, crushed petals below the rose arch. Miss Marple's sensible shoes crunched softly on the gravel as she approached, her eyes scanning the scene with the quiet precision of a hawk. A small knot of villagers had gathered beneath the arch, their voices a low hum of speculation. Mr. Hayworth, the local butcher, stood with his hands on his hips, peering at the ground. "Look at those petals," he said, his voice carrying a note of triumph, as if he alone had uncovered a great secret. "Smashed to bits, just like the note said. I reckon there's something buried right here." Beside him, Miss Clara Finch, the schoolmistress, adjusted her spectacles and frowned. "Don't be daft, George," she retorted. "If there's treasure, it's not likely to be under everyone's feet. It's a clue, not a map." Their debate drew a few curious onlookers, including young Tommy Clement, the vicar's nephew, who darted through the crowd with the restless energy of a boy sensing adventure. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the group, her expression one of mild curiosity, though her mind was anything but idle. She knelt, her movements slow and deliberate, to examine the petals scattered across the path. They were, indeed, crushed, their delicate crimson edges bruised and torn, forming a rough oval beneath the arch's shadow. But it was not the petals themselves that caught her attention, it was their arrangement. The damage was too precise, too contained, as if someone had deliberately trodden them into place rather than letting them fall naturally. She brushed a gloved finger against one, noting its freshness. These were not old petals, wilted by time, but ones recently plucked or pressed. Most peculiar, she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the chatter. Rising, she turned her gaze to the arch itself. The trellis was a sturdy lattice of weathered wood, painted green to blend with the vines, though here and there the paint had chipped, revealing the grain beneath. The roses clung thickly, their thorns hidden among the leaves. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something else, a faint glint, almost imperceptible, nestled among the foliage near the arch's apex. She stepped closer, shielding her eyes from the sun's glare. There, tucked behind a cluster of leaves, was a thin wire, its metallic sheen betraying its presence. It snaked downward, disappearing into the vines, and seemed out of place in the natural splendor of the garden. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A wire in a rose arch was not something one encountered every day, and it suggested a purpose. Beyond mere decoration, Miss Marple, what do you make of it? Came a voice at her elbow. It was Mrs. Pennyworth, the manor's housekeeper, her round face flushed with the day's exertions. Her apron was dusted with flour, and a stray curl of grey hair peeked from beneath her cap. She had been bustling about all morning, overseeing the Fate's refreshment tables, but the treasure rumour had clearly drawn her to the arch. Those petals, do you think they're really a clue? Everyone's talking about it, and I confess, I'm half tempted to dig up the path myself. Her eyes sparkled with a mixture of hope and mischief, for the manor's upkeep weighed heavily on her shoulders, and a hidden fortune could solve many a problem. Miss Marple smiled, her expression warm but guarded. It's a curious thing, Mrs. Pennyworth, she said, her voice soft yet clear. But clues are often less about what they show than what they hide. I wonder who might have placed these petals here and why. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Mrs. Pennyworth blinked, her enthusiasm tempered by a flicker. Of unease, you think someone's playing a trick? She asked, lowering her voice. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. People are fond of their games, especially when there's an audience. But we shall see. The housekeeper nodded, though her brow furrowed as she glanced back at the petals. Miss Marple, meanwhile, stepped closer to the arch, her fingers brushing the vines as if admiring the roses. She traced the path of the wire with her eyes, noting how it vanished into the dense foliage. It was too high to reach without a ladder, and she had no intention of drawing attention to her discovery just yet. Instead, she turned her attention to the crowd, her mind cataloguing faces and behaviours. Mr. Hayworth was now poking at the ground with a stick, much to Miss Finch's exasperation. Tommy Clement hovered nearby, his eyes wide with curiosity, while a newcomer, Mr. Clarence, lingered at the edge of the group, his notebook in hand and his gaze fixed on the arch with an intensity that struck Miss Marple as unusual. Mr. Clarence was a recent arrival in St. Mary's Mead, a man of middle age with a polished manner and a penchant for tailored suits that seemed out of place among the village's more practical attire. He had introduced himself as a historian, claiming an interest in the manor's past, but Miss Marple had noted his tendency to ask pointed questions about the estate's ownership and value. Now, as he sketched the arch in his notebook, his pencil moving with quick, precise strokes, she wondered what he sought. Was he merely a curious scholar, or did he know more about the treasure rumour than he let on? Tommy, Miss Marple called softly, beckoning the boy over. He bounded to her side, his freckled face alight with excitement. "Miss Marple, are you hunting for the treasure too?" he asked, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. She chuckled, patting his shoulder. I'm hunting for sense, Tommy, which is often harder to find. Tell me, have you noticed anything odd about this arch? Anything that doesn't belong? The boy's eyes widened, and he squinted at the trellis, his head tilting. There's a funny wire up there, he said after a moment, pointing to the spot Miss Marple had already seen. Looks like it's stuck in the roses. Maybe it's part of the clue. Miss Marple nodded, her expression encouraging. Very observant, Tommy. But let's keep that between us for now, shall we? No need to spoil the fun for everyone else. The boy grinned, delighted to be part of a secret, and scampered off to rejoin his friends. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the wire, her mind turning over possibilities. A wire suggested machinery, perhaps a light or a speaker, something modern, not part of Colonel Hargrove's era. The treasure, if it existed, was tied to a man long dead. But this wire was new, its presence deliberate. Someone was orchestrating this mystery, and the crushed petals were merely the opening act. She wandered back toward the oak, her knitting bag slung over her arm, but her thoughts were far from the fate's cheerful chaos. The rose arch was a stage, and the petals a prop, carefully placed to draw the crowd's attention. But why? To distract from something else, perhaps, or to lure someone specific to the spot. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm as she settled onto her bench, but her eyes never left the arch. She noted the comings and goings of the villagers, the way Mr. Clarence lingered longer than necessary, the way Mrs. Pennyworth glanced nervously at the manor's windows, as if expecting someone to emerge. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd's excitement grew. A few adventurous souls began poking at the soil beneath the arch, though they found only dirt and pebbles. Miss Finch, ever practical, scolded them for ruining the path, while Mr. Hayworth insisted on borrowing a spade from the gardener's shed. Miss Marple watched it all, her mind piecing together the fragments of the day. The note, the petals, the wire, they were parts of a puzzle, but not the whole. Someone had set this scene, and she suspected they were watching now, gauging the crowd's reaction. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Thomas Grimsby, the manor's head gardener, a wiry man with soil-stained hands and a perpetually furrowed brow. He carried a pair of pruning shears, his movements brisk as he inspected the roses. Mind the arch, now, he called to the crowd, his voice gruff. You'll trample my work. Miss Marple noted his unease, the way his eyes darted to the petals and then away, as if he wished to avoid the topic altogether. She made a mental note to speak with him later. Gardeners, she knew, saw more than most, their days spent in quiet observation of the earth and its secrets. The fete continued, with laughter and music filling the air, but Miss Marple's attention remained fixed on the rose arch. The wire, the petals, the anonymous note, they were threads in a tapestry, and she was determined to unravel it. She thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry, who had once remarked that Miss Marple saw too much in simple things. It's not the things themselves, Dolly, Miss Marple had replied, but the people behind them. And someone, she was certain, was behind this riddle, pulling strings as deftly as she worked her knitting needles. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the garden, Miss Marple rose once more, her steps purposeful. She would return to the arch tonight, when the fete had quieted and the curious had gone home. The wire intrigued her, and she suspected it held the key to the next clue. For now, she resumed her place among the villagers, her gentle smile masking the sharp mind that was already at work, piecing together the riddle under the rose arch. Chapter 3. The tapping at night. The summer fete had wound down, leaving Rosewood Manor's gardens bathed in the soft hush of twilight. The stalls were dismantled, their colourful awnings folded away, and the last of the villagers had trickled back to their cottages, their voices fading into the evening air. A gentle breeze stirred the roses, carrying their sweet scent across the grounds, while the first stars began to prick the deepening sky. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, lingered near the rose arch, her figure a small, unassuming silhouette against the grandeur of the manor. The crowd's fervour over the treasure rumour had subsided for now, but Miss Marple's curiosity burned brighter than ever. The crushed petals and the mysterious wire she had spotted earlier in the day were pieces of a puzzle, and she sensed the next clue lay in wait, hidden in the quiet of the night. She had chosen to stay late, declining Mrs. Pennyworth's offer of a lift back to her cottage. "A little evening air does one good," she had said with a smile, though her true purpose was to observe the arch undisturbed. The wire, tucked among the vines, had suggested something mechanical, a device, perhaps meant to mislead or intrigue. Miss Marple was no stranger to village pranks, but this felt different, more calculated, as if someone were orchestrating a performance for a specific audience. She settled onto a wrought iron bench near the fountain, a short distance from the arch, where she could watch without being seen. Her knitting needles lay idle in her lap, for once. As her eyes adjusted to the dimming light, the manor grounds were eerily still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant bark of a dog. The rose arch loomed ahead, its crimson blooms now shadowed, their vibrant colour muted to a deep, velvety hue. Miss Marple's gaze was fixed on the trellis, her mind replaying the day's events, the anonymous note, the deliberately crushed petals, the wire glinting in the foliage. She was certain the arch held more secrets, and she was prepared to wait for them to reveal themselves. The village clock struck 9, its chimes rolling softly across the gardens, and she pulled her shawl closer, the evening air carrying a slight chill. Then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, sharp and distinct, like the peck of a woodpecker or the tick of a telegraph key. It came from the direction of the rose arch, irregular but deliberate, a pattern that seemed to mimic Morse code yet lacked its precision. Tap tap, pause, tap, pause, tap tap. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. She rose, her movements slow to avoid drawing attention, and edged closer to the arch, her shoes silent on the grass. The tapping grew clearer as she approached, emanating from somewhere within the trellis itself. She strained her ears, noting the sequence. Short, short, long, pause, short, long. It was not a coherent message, she realized, but a signal designed to be heard and wondered at. She paused beneath the arch, her eyes scanning the vines. The wire she had noticed earlier was still there, barely visible in the twilight, but the tapping seemed to come from higher up, near the apex where the roses were thickest. She considered climbing the trellis. Younger woman might have tried, but her sensible nature prevailed. Instead, she stepped back, her gaze sweeping the surrounding shadows. The gardens were empty, or so they seemed, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. Someone was behind this, and they might be watching even now. The tapping ceased abruptly, as if the unseen performer had sensed her presence. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint gurgle of the fountain. Miss Marple stood, motionless, her mind racing. The sound had been too clear to be natural. A branch, against wood or a creature in the vines would not produce such a rhythm. No, this was artificial, likely tied to the wire she had seen. A speaker, perhaps, or some other device hidden in the foliage. The thought intrigued her, for it suggested a modern hand at work, someone with access to tools and a motive to stir the treasure rumour. But who, and to what end? She returned to the bench, her thoughts turning to the villagers she had observed. That day, Mr. Grimsby, the gardener, had been quick to dismiss the crushed petals, his manner evasive. Mrs. Pennyworth, with her dreams of saving the manor, might see a treasure hunt as a means to draw attention and funds. Then there was Mr. Clarence, the historian, whose interest in the arch had seemed more than academic. His notebook, filled with sketches of the trellis, hinted at a deeper purpose. Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if longing to pick up her needles, but she remained focused, her mind piecing together the fragments of the mystery. The manor itself loomed in the background, its windows dark save for a single light in the upper story, where Mrs. Pennyworth was likely tidying up after the fête. Miss Marple considered the manor's history, which she had gleaned from village gossip and old records. Colonel Hargrove, its former owner, had been a man of secrets, a retired military officer with a penchant for codes and ciphers. His death 20 years prior had left rumours of a hidden fortune, though no proof had ever surfaced. The anonymous note, with its mention of crushed petals, felt like an echo of those old tales, but the tapping and the wire were new, suggesting someone was reviving the legend for their own purposes. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a faint rustle in the bushes to her left. She turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. The sound was too deliberate to be the wind, too soft to be careless. "Who's there?" she called, her voice calm but firm. No answer came, but the rustling stopped, and she sensed a presence retreating into the darkness. She made a mental note to explore the area later. For now, she returned her attention to the arch. The tapping had not resumed, and she suspected it would not, at least not while she was there. Whoever was behind it had been spooked, which meant they were close enough to know she was watching. She decided to take a closer look at the trellis, though she moved cautiously, aware that she was alone in the gardens. The wire, she noted, was thin and black, designed to blend with the vines. It ran vertically, disappearing into the soil at the base of the arch, where a small mound of earth had been disturbed. She knelt, her fingers brushing the ground. The soil was loose, as if recently turned, but she found no device, only the wire's end, buried shallowly. It was a clue, but an incomplete one, and she resolved to enlist young Tommy Clement's help in the morning. A boy's agility would be useful for climbing the trellis, and his enthusiasm would keep him discreet. As she straightened, a figure emerged from the path leading to the manor man, his silhouette tall and lean against the faint glow of the house. It was Mr. Clarence, his coat draped over his arm and his notebook still in hand. He paused when he saw her, his expression one of polite surprise. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth. "Out late, aren't you? Admiring the roses by moonlight." His smile was charming, but Miss Marple noted the slight tension in his posture, the way his fingers tightened around the notebook. "I find the evening air quite refreshing," she replied, her tone mild. "And the gardens are so peaceful at this hour. Have you been sketching again, Mr. Clarence?" She nodded toward his notebook, her eyes meeting his. He hesitated, then laughed lightly. "You've caught me," he said. "The arch is a fine piece of architecture. I thought I'd capture its lines before the light fades entirely." His explanation was plausible, but Miss Marple's instincts told her there was more to his interest. She smiled, giving nothing away. "It is a lovely structure," she said, "though I dare say it holds more than beauty tonight." Mr. Clarence's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly. "You mean the treasure nonsense? Village gossip, surely. I wouldn't put much stock in it." He tipped his hat and moved on, his steps brisk as he headed toward the village. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloguing his words, his manner, the way he had appeared just as the tapping ceased. Coincidence, perhaps, but she doubted it. She lingered a while longer. But the gardens remained silent, the arch yielding no further secrets. Finally, she gathered her things and made her way home, the path lit by the soft glow of lanterns along the manor's drive. Back at her cottage, she lit a lamp and retrieved an old Morse code chart from a drawer, a relic from her nephew Raymond's. Naval days. She jotted down the tapping pattern she had heard. Short, short, long, pause, short, long. It formed no recognizable word, confirming her suspicion that it was not a message but a lure, meant to intrigue rather than inform. She sat back, her eyes thoughtful. The tapping, like the petals in the wire, was a performance, and someone was directing it with care as she prepared for bed. Her mind turned to the villagers, Mr. Grimsby's unease, Mrs. Pennyworth's desperation. Mr. Clarence's calculated charm each was a thread in the tapestry of the mystery. The tapping suggested a device which pointed to someone with technical skill or at least access to modern gadgets. The manor's staff, the Fate's organizers, even the newcomers like Mr. Clarence were suspects, though none yet stood out as the puppeteer. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Colonel Hargrove's era, to the stories of his coded letters and hidden caches. The treasure might be real, but the tapping was not part of his legacy. It was a modern flourish, and she intended to find its source. She extinguished the lamp and settled into her armchair, her eyes resting on the dark window. The riddle under the rose arch was growing more complex, but Miss Marple was undaunted. She had unravelled knottier mysteries than this, armed with nothing more than her understanding of human nature. Tomorrow she would return to the arch with Tommy, and together they would uncover the truth behind the tapping. For now, she closed her eyes, the faint echo of that rhythmic sound still lingering in her mind. A challenge she was ready to meet. Chapter 4. The Gardener's Tale. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary's Mead, casting a warm glow across the dew-kissed lawns of Rosewood Manor. The fervour of the previous day's fête had settled into a quiet hum of anticipation, as villagers whispered anew about the treasure rumoured to lie hidden within the estate's grounds. Miss Jane Marple, refreshed after a night of thoughtful reflection, set out early, her sensible shoes crunching along the path to the manor. Her knitting bag swung lightly at her side, but her mind was far from idle, turning over the events of the previous evening, the mysterious tapping near the rose arch, the hidden wire, and the carefully crushed petals. These were not random acts, she was certain, but parts of a deliberate design, and she intended to uncover the hand behind them. Her destination was the gardener's shed, a modest structure tucked behind the rose arch, its weathered wood half hidden by climbing ivy and a profusion of marigolds. The shed belonged to Mr. Thomas Grimsby, the manor's head gardener, whose guarded demeanour the previous day had caught Miss Marple's attention. She had noted his quick dismissal of the crushed petals, his eyes darting away as if to avoid scrutiny, and she suspected he knew more than he let on. Gardeners, she had often observed, were privy to secrets others overlooked, their days spent in quiet communion with the earth. If anyone had seen something amiss near the rose arch, it would be Grimsby. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly turned soil and blooming roses as Miss Marple approached the shed. The manor grounds were still quiet, the Fates. Clean-up not yet begun, and only a few early risers, groundskeepers and kitchen staff moved about in the distance. The shed's door was ajar, and through the gap she glimpsed Grimsby bent over a workbench, his wiry frame hunched as he sorted through a pile of seed packets. His hands, rough and stained with earth, moved with the practiced ease of a man who lived for his craft. But there was a tension in his shoulders that suggested he was not entirely at ease. "Good morning, Mr. Grimsby," Miss Marple called, her voice bright and unassuming as she stepped into the doorway. The gardener started slightly, his head jerking up, and for a moment his eyes held a flicker of wariness before he mastered with a curt nod. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff, "early for a visit, ain't it? Come to see the roses again." He turned back to his packets, but his movements were less steady now, betraying a nervousness that Miss Marple noted with interest. "I couldn't help but admire your work yesterday," she said, stepping inside the shed. The interior was a clutter of tool spades, shears, and trowels hung on the walls, while sacks of fertilizer and coils of twine littered the floor. A faint musty smell hung in the air, mingled with the sharp tang of linseed oil. "Those roses under the arch are quite splendid this year. You must be very proud." Her tone was warm, inviting confidence, but her eyes were sharp, taking in every detail: the worn workbench, the stack of empty pots, and, most notably, a single wooden board on the back wall that seemed slightly askew, its edges chipped as if frequently handled. Grimsby grunted, his attention fixed on a packet of marigold seeds. "They do well enough," he muttered. "Takes work, mind you. Folks trampling through don't help." His words were pointed, and Miss Marple seized the opening. "Yes, those crushed petals under the arch were such a pity," she said, her voice laced with just a hint of sympathy. "Almost as if someone did it on purpose, don't you think? To draw attention, perhaps." The gardener's fingers twitched, and a seed packet slipped from his grasp, scattering tiny black specks across the workbench. He cursed under his breath, stooping to gather them, but Miss Marple saw the flush creeping up his neck. "Kids, probably," he said, his voice tighter now. "Always mucking about, breaking things. Or them fake-goers, poking where they shouldn't." He straightened, avoiding her gaze, and busied himself with a rusty spade, polishing its edge with a rag. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Perhaps," she said, "but it's curious, isn't it? The petals, the note about treasure it, all seems rather theatrical, almost as if someone wanted the crowd to look at the arch and nowhere else." She paused, letting her words settle, and watched as Grimsby's hands stilled on the spade. His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might speak, but he only shook his head and muttered something about needing to check the rosebeds. She stepped closer to the workbench, her eyes lingering on the loose board. It was oak, like the rest of the shed, but its edges were worn smooth, as if it had been lifted and replaced many times. "This is a fine old shed," she remarked, her tone conversational. "Been here as long as the manor, I expect. Plenty of places to hide. Things, I imagine." She smiled, but her gaze was steady, and Grimsby's eyes flicked toward the board before he caught himself. "Ain't nothing hidden here," he said quickly, too quickly, and Miss Marple noted the defensiveness in his tone. Just tools and such. No call for poking about. He moved to block her view of the wall, his stance protective, and she knew she had struck a nerve. She nodded, as if satisfied, and turned toward the door. "Of course," she said. "I wouldn't dream of disturbing your work. But do be careful. Mr. Grimsby, treasure rumors bring out all sorts of curiosity, and not everyone is as discreet as they should be." As she stepped outside, the morning light caught the rose arch, its crimson blooms glowing against the green trellis. She paused, her mind racing. Grimsby's unease was palpable, and that board there was something behind it, she was certain. But she would need more than suspicion to unravel the mystery, and she had no intention of confronting him directly just yet. Instead, she resolved to keep an eye on the shed, perhaps enlisting young Tommy Clement to watch for any unusual activity. Boys like Tommy, with their boundless energy and knack for slipping unnoticed into corners, were invaluable in such matters. She made her way back to the main path, her thoughts turning to the tapping she had heard the previous night. The rhythmic sound, like a half-formed Morse code, had come from the arch, likely tied to the wire she had spotted. It was no coincidence, she thought, that Grimsby worked so close to the arch, his shed mere steps away. Could he be the one behind the tapping, using it to fuel the treasure rumor? But why? To distract from the shed, perhaps, or to draw attention to the arch for some other purpose. Miss Marple's mind flitted to the manor's history, to Colonel Hargrove's reputed fortune. Grimsby, as the gardener, would have intimate knowledge of the ground's every nook, every hiding place. If there was treasure, he might know where to look, or he might be protecting something else entirely. As she walked, she passed the fountain, its gentle splash a soothing counterpoint to her racing thoughts. She recalled the rustle in the bushes the previous night, the sense of being watched. Grimsby had not been there, she was certain, but someone else had, perhaps Mr. Clarence, whose late-night sketching had seemed so convenient, or Mrs. Pennyworth, whose desperation to save the manor might drive her to desperate measures. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. People, she had learned, were rarely as clever as they thought, and their motives often lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered by a patient observer. She reached the manor's main lawn, where a few workers were clearing away the last of the Fate's debris, empty cups, crumpled napkins, and a forgotten parasol leaning against a tree. Mrs. Pennyworth emerged from the manor's side door, her arms laden with a tray of teacups. "Miss Marple," she called, her face lighting up. "You're up early, still thinking about that treasure, I'll wager." Her tone was teasing, but there was an edge to it, a hopefulness that bordered on anxiety. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "It's a fascinating puzzle, Mrs. Pennyworth, but I find it's often the simplest. Clues that lead to the truth." The housekeeper laughed, though it sounded forced. "Well, if you find that treasure, do let me know. The manor could use a bit of gold to patch its roof." She hurried off, leaving Miss Marple to ponder her words. Mrs. Pennyworth's eagerness was understandable, but it raised questions. Was she merely hopeful, or did she know something about the rumor's origins? Miss Marple filed the thought away, her mind returning to Grimsby and the shed. She decided to take a circuitous route back to the village, passing the rose arch once more. The petals were still there, their bruised edges stark against the gravel, and she noted that no one had disturbed them further. The wire, too, remained in place, its presence a silent challenge. She considered the tapping again, its irregular rhythm echoing in her memory. It was not a message, she was certain, but a signal, meant to intrigue or mislead. Grimsby, with his access to the arch and the shed, was a likely candidate, but she needed evidence, not speculation. As she neared her cottage, she spotted Tommy, Clement, racing down the lane, his cap askew and his face alight with excitement. "Miss Marple," he called, skidding to a stop. "I heard something last night, near the arch. A funny noise, like tapping. Did you hear it too?" His eyes were wide, and Miss Marple smiled, patting his shoulder. "I did, Tommy," she said, "and I think you might help me find out what it was. Would you be willing to keep an eye on the arch today? Discreetly, mind you. No one must know you're watching." Tommy grinned, delighted to be part of a mystery. "I'll be like a detective," he said, and Miss Marple chuckled. "Exactly so. But detectives are quiet, Tommy. Watch and listen and tell me what you see." She sent him off with a penny for sweets, knowing his sharp eyes would miss little. As she entered her cottage, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The gardener's tale was beginning to take shape, and with it, the riddle under the rose arch. Grimsby's unease, the loose board, the tapping all, were threads in a tapestry, and Miss Marple was determined to weave them together. For now, she would wait, her patience as steady as her knitting, knowing that the truth, like a well-tended garden, would reveal itself in time. Chapter 5. The hidden speaker. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gardens of Rosewood Manor, where the echoes of the summer fete lingered in the form of stray bunting and the faint scent of lemonade. The excitement over the rumoured treasure had not abated, and small groups of villagers still wandered the grounds, their eyes darting to the rose arch in hopes of uncovering a clue. Miss Jane Marple, however, was not among the treasure hunters. She stood near the manor's fountain, her lavender cardigan buttoned against a breeze that carried the first hints of autumn. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, but her hands were still, her sharp eyes fixed on the rose arch, where the mystery of the crushed petals, the wire, and the nocturnal tapping continued to unfold. The previous night's discovery of the tapping sound had confirmed her suspicions. Someone was orchestrating the treasure rumour with deliberate care, using modern devices to fuel the villagers' imagination. The wire she had spotted in the trellis, coupled with Mr. Grimsby's unease and the suspiciously placed petals, pointed to a scheme that was both calculated and contemporary. Miss Marple had resolved to investigate further, but she knew she needed help to explore the arch's higher reaches, where the wire vanished into the vines. For this, she turned to young Tommy Clement, the vicar's nephew, whose boundless energy and knack for mischief made him an ideal ally in such matters. Tommy arrived promptly at noon, his freckled face flushed with excitement as he clutched a small flashlight Miss Marple had lent him. "Ready, Miss Marple," he declared, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "I've been watching the arch all morning, like you said. Nobody's touched it, but I saw Mr. Grimsby poking around his shed again, looked nervous." "He did." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet approval. "Well done, Tommy," she said. "Now, I need you to do something a bit more daring. There's a wire in the rose arch, up high among the vines. I'd like you to see if you can find where it leads. But be careful, and don't let anyone see." "You," Tommy's eyes widened, and he gave a mock salute, like a secret agent. He said, and before Miss Marple could caution him further, he was off, scrambling toward the arch with the agility of a squirrel. She watched from a distance, settling onto a nearby bench where she could observe without drawing attention. The manor grounds were busier now, with villagers and a few lingering fete-goers milling about. but the rose arch remained relatively quiet, its crimson blooms swaying gently in the breeze. Tommy climbed the trellis with ease, his small hands finding holds among the wooden slats. He disappeared into the foliage, only the occasional rustle betraying his presence. Miss Marple's gaze swept the gardens, noting the comings and goings of those nearby. Mrs. Pennyworth was directing a pair of maids near the tea tent, her voice carrying a note of exasperation as she pointed to a stack of unwashed cups. Mr. Clarence, the historian, was nowhere to be seen, though Miss Marple had spotted him earlier, lingering near the manor's library with his ever-present notebook. Mr. Grimsby, meanwhile, was pruning a hedge near his shed, his movements brisk but his eyes darting toward the arch every so often. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The gardener's vigilance suggested he was guarding something, perhaps the loose board she had noticed in his shed. A sudden shout broke her reverie. "Miss Marple," Tommy called, his voice muffled by the vines. He emerged from the trellis, his cap askew and his hands clutching a small, black object. He slid down with a grin, landing lightly on the gravel path and hurrying to her side. "Look what I found," he said, holding out a battery-powered speaker, its plastic casing scratched but intact. A thin wire trailed from it, matching the one Miss Marple had seen in the arch. It was tucked right up there, behind the roses. Had to wiggle it loose, but it's got a little switch and everything. Miss Marple took the speaker, her gloved fingers turning it over with care. It was a cheap model, the kind sold in village shops for amplifying music or announcements, but its presence in the rose arch was anything but ordinary. The wire, she noted, was connected to a small battery pack, still functional, though the switch was in the off position. "Very clever," she murmured, her eyes narrowing. "Well done, Tommy. This is exactly what I hoped you'd find." She slipped the speaker into her knitting bag, out of sight, and patted the boy's shoulder. "Now, this is our little secret, understand? Not a word to anyone, not even your uncle." Tommy nodded vigorously, his chest puffed with pride. "I won't tell, Miss Marple. But what's it for? Is it part of the treasure?" His curiosity was infectious, but Miss Marple kept her expression neutral. "It's a clue, Tommy," she said, "and a very important one. Run along now, but keep your eyes open. If you see anyone near the arch or the shed, let me know." The boy scampered off, his flashlight bouncing in his pocket, and Miss Marple returned to her bench, her mind racing. The speaker explained the tapping she had heard the previous night. It was no natural sound, no branch or creature, but a deliberate signal, likely triggered to mimic Morse code and fuel the treasure rumor. Someone had placed it in the arch, wired it to a power source, and set it to play at night when curious. Ears might be listening, but why? To draw attention to the arch, perhaps, or to distract from something else. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the shed, to the loose board she had noticed behind Grimsby's workbench. The speaker was a modern contrivance, but the treasure, if it existed, was tied to Colonel Hargrove's era, a time of paper maps and hidden caches. The contrast intrigued her, suggesting a scheme that blended old legends with new tricks. She rose, her steps purposeful, and made her way toward the gardener's shed, intending to observe Grimsby from a distance. The shed was quiet now, its door closed, but she could see the gardener through the small window, sorting tools with a distracted air. She did not approach, knowing he would be wary after their earlier conversation, but she noted the shed's proximity to the arch close enough for someone to slip out at night and activate the speaker without being seen. The loose board, she suspected held a secret, perhaps a hiding place for the device's controls, or something more significant. As she lingered, Mrs. Pennyworth appeared on the path, her apron dusted with flour, and her face flushed from her morning's work. "Miss Marple still sleuthing?" she called, her tone light but her eyes searching. "I swear, you're as curious as the rest of us about this treasure business." Miss Marple smiled, her expression disarming. "It's a puzzle, Mrs. Pennyworth, and I do enjoy a good puzzle. Have you heard anything new about the note? Or perhaps seen anyone near the arch at odd hours?" She kept her voice casual, but her question was pointed, and the housekeeper hesitated, her fingers twisting in her apron. "Not a thing," Mrs. Pennyworth said, a touch too quickly. "Though I did see Mr. Clarence sketching again this morning. Always scribbling, that one. Makes you wonder what he's after." She laughed, but it was a nervous sound, and Miss Marple noted it, filing it away with her other observations. The housekeeper hurried off, muttering about a delivery of scones, and Miss Marple turned her attention back to the arch. The speaker's discovery was a breakthrough, but it raised new questions. Who had placed it, and how did they know the arch would draw such attention? The anonymous note, with its mention of crushed petals, had set the stage, but the speaker added a layer of theatricality that suggested a deeper motive. Miss Marple considered the villagers she had encountered. Grimsby, with his guarded manor and proximity to the arch; Mrs. Pennyworth, whose desperation to save the manor might push her to desperate measures; and Mr. Clarence, whose interest in the estate's history seemed to mask a more personal agenda. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but none yet fit perfectly. She decided to visit the village library, where Miss Hartnell, the librarian, might shed light on the manor's past. Colonel Hargrove's legend was well known, but Miss Marple wanted specific letters, diaries, anything that might confirm the treasure's existence or point to its hiding place. She made her way to the library, a small stone building near the village square, its shelves lined with dusty tomes and yellowed records. Miss Hartnell, a thin woman with a penchant for pince-nez and a love of local history, greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, come for a bit of reading, or is it the treasure talk that brings you?" she asked, her eyes twinkling behind her glasses. "A bit of both, perhaps," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair by the window. "I'm curious about Colonel Hargrove. There's so much talk of his fortune, but I wonder if there's any truth to it. Have you anything in the records about his time at the manor?" Miss Hartnell, delighted by the request, bustled to a cabinet and returned with a stack of papers, including a ledger and a bundle of letters tied with string. "The Colonel was a queer sort," she said, spreading the documents on the table. "Loved his codes and secrets. There's a letter here from his sister, mentioning a rose-shed cache. Never made much sense to me, but with all this talk of treasure, it might mean something." Miss Marple's heart quickened as she read the letter, its ink faded but legible. It spoke of the Colonel's habit of hiding valuables in unexpected places, including a cache behind the wall of blooms. The phrase was tantalizingly close to the shed's loose board, and Miss Marple made a mental note to investigate it further. She thanked Miss Hartnell, promising to return the next day, and left the library with a renewed sense of purpose. The speaker was a modern trick, but the treasure, if real, was rooted in the past, and the shed might bridge the two. As she walked back to the manor, she spotted Mr. Clarence near the rose arch, his notebook open and his pencil moving swiftly. He glanced up, catching her eye, and offered a polite nod before turning away. Miss Marple's instincts prickled. His presence was too frequent, his interest too keen. She resolved to keep a closer watch on him, perhaps through Tommy's eager eyes. For now, she would keep the speaker's discovery quiet, sharing it only with the boy. The riddle under the rose arch was growing clearer, but the puppeteer remained in the shadows, and Miss Marple was determined to draw them into the light. Chapter 6. The Manor's Secrets. The sun hung low over St. Mary's Mead, bathing the gardens of Rosewood Manor in a golden haze that softened the edges of the rose arch and cast intricate shadows across the gravel paths. The second day of the summer fête was in full swing, with villagers weaving through stalls laden with homemade jams and knitted shawls, their chatter punctuated by bursts of laughter and the clink of teacups. Yet beneath the festive cheer, the whisper of buried treasure lingered, fueled by the anonymous note and the curious discoveries at the Rose Arch. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a bench near the manor's ancient yew hedge, observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity. Her knitting needles lay idle in her lap, for her mind was wholly occupied with the puzzle that had unfolded, the crushed petals, the hidden speaker, and the rhythmic tapping that had echoed through the night. The discovery of the speaker, tucked high in the rose arch by young Tommy Clement, had confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion that the treasure rumour was no mere village fancy but a carefully orchestrated scheme. The device, with its cheap plastic casing and trailing wire, was a modern contrivance, far removed from the era of Colonel Hargrove, whose rumoured fortune lay at the heart of the mystery. Yet the letter she had read in the village library, penned by the Colonel's sister, hinted at a rose-shed cache, a phrase that resonated with the loose board she had noticed in Mr. Grimsby's shed. The contrast between the old legend and the new trick intrigued her, suggesting a mind at work that knew both the manor's history and the power of suggestion. Miss Marple rose, her lavender cardigan neatly buttoned, and made her way toward the village library once more. She had promised Miss Hartnell, the librarian, to return for further research, and she hoped to uncover more about Colonel Hargrove's habits. The manor's secrets, she sensed, were not buried in the ground, but hidden in its past, in documents and memories that might point to the truth behind the treasure. The library, a quaint stone building with ivy-clad walls, stood at the edge of the village square, its windows aglow with the soft light of late afternoon. Miss Hartnell greeted her with a smile, her pince-nez glinting as she waved Miss Marple to a table piled with old ledgers and correspondence. "You're back sooner than I expected, Miss Marple," Miss Hartnell said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Still chasing that treasure, or is it the Colonel's ghost that's caught your fancy?" She chuckled, but her eyes were sharp, eager for gossip. Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair. "A bit of history never hurts, Miss Hartnell," she replied. "I find the past has a way of explaining the present, don't you?" The librarian nodded, bustling to retrieve a leather-bound volume she had set aside. "I found something else you might like," she said, placing it before Miss Marple, the Colonel's estate records, from just before he died. Not much about treasure, mind you, but plenty about his odd ways. Miss Marple opened the volume, its pages yellowed and brittle, and began to read. Colonel Hargrove had been a man of meticulous habits, a retired officer with a passion for puzzles and a distrust of banks. His records detailed the manor's upkeep, staff, repairs, but also hinted at his penchant for secrecy. One entry, dated 20 years prior, mentioned a safeguard for my legacy, hidden where the roses guard the heart of the estate. Another spoke of a cache secured beyond prying eyes, a phrase that echoed the letter's mention of a rose-shed cache. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the page, her mind turning to the gardener's shed, its loose board a silent invitation. To explore further, she thanked Miss Hartnell and asked to see any correspondence from the Colonel's later years. The librarian produced a bundle of letters, their wax seals cracked but intact, and Miss Marple spent the next hour poring over them. Most were mundane orders for seeds, requests for repairs, but one, written to a cousin in London, stood out. "I have insured my fortune's safety," the Colonel wrote, "in a place where only those who know my mind might look. The roses will keep it, as they have kept my solitude." The letter was vague, but its tone was deliberate, as if the Colonel had anticipated curious eyes. Miss Marple made a note of the phrase, her thoughts circling back to the shed and its proximity to the rose arch as she left the library. The village square was alive with the Fête's second day. Children darting through the crowd with sticky fingers and bright eyes. Miss Marple made her way back to the manor, her steps measured but purposeful. The rose arch loomed ahead, its crimson blooms vivid against the green trellis, and she paused to examine it once more. The crushed petals were still there, though some had been scattered by passing feet, and the wires absent thanks to Tommy's find left, the arch looking deceptively innocent. Yet Miss Marple knew better. The speaker had been a lure, designed to draw attention to the arch, but the real secret, she suspected, lay elsewhere, perhaps in the shed or another overlooked corner of the grounds. She circled toward the gardener's shed, keeping to the shadows of the yew hedge to avoid notice. Mr. Grimsby was nowhere to be seen, likely tending to his duties elsewhere, and the shed's door was closed, a rusty padlock securing it. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the loose board, visible through a small window, its edges worn as if handled often. She considered investigating it now, but the risk of being seen was too great, especially with the Fête in progress. Instead, she resolved to return at dusk, when the crowds had thinned and the manor grounds were quiet. As she turned back toward the main lawn, she spotted Mrs. Pennyworth near the tea tent, her apron flapping as she directed a young maid to rearrange a tray of scones. The housekeeper's face was flushed, her eyes darting nervously toward the manor, and Miss Marple wondered what troubled her. Was it merely the strain of managing the Fête, or did she know something about the treasure rumour? Mrs. Pennyworth had been quick to embrace the tale, her hope for the manor's salvation almost palpable. But Miss Marple sensed a deeper anxiety beneath her cheerful facade. "Mrs. Pennyworth," Miss Marple called, approaching with a smile. "The Fête is a triumph, as always. You must be exhausted." The housekeeper laughed, though it was a brittle sound. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's a madhouse, but we manage. Have you found any clues about that treasure? The whole village is talking of nothing else." Her eyes searched Miss Marple's face, and the older woman kept her expression bland. "Only whispers and guesses," she said. "But I wonder, has anyone been near the Rose Arch at odd hours, or perhaps the shed? It's such a central spot for all this excitement." Mrs. Pennyworth hesitated, her fingers twisting in her apron. "Not that I've seen," she said, her voice a touch too bright, "though Mr. Grimsby's always about, tending his roses. And that Mr. Clarency's been sketching the arch again, bold as brass. Thinks he's an artist, I suppose." She laughed again, but Miss Marple noted the strain in her voice, the way her eyes flicked toward the shed before returning to the tray of scones. "Well, I must get on," Mrs. Pennyworth said, hurrying off, and Miss Marple watched her go, her mind cataloguing the housekeeper's unease. Mr. Clarence, she thought, was another piece of the puzzle. His frequent appearances near the arch, his notebook filled with sketches, suggested an interest that went beyond scholarly curiosity. She had seen him that morning, lingering near the manor's library, his eyes scanning the windows as if searching for something. His claim to be a historian was plausible, but Miss Marple had learned to distrust polished explanations, especially from newcomers. She made a mental note to speak with him, perhaps under the guise of asking about his research, to gauge his true intentions. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple joined the crowd at the fête, her presence unremarkable among the villagers. She sipped tea at a stall, listening to the gossip swirling around her. The treasure rumour had grown, with some claiming the colonel had hidden gold, others insisting it was jewels, or even a lost manuscript. Miss Marple smiled to herself, recognizing the embellishments of village imagination, but her thoughts remained on the shed and the letter's mention of a rose-shed cache. The speaker, she was certain, was a distraction, meant to keep eyes on the arch, while the real secret lay elsewhere. She spotted Tommy Clement racing through the crowd, his cap askew and his face alight with excitement. "Miss Marple," he whispered, sidling up to her. "I saw Mr. Grimsby go into the shed just now, and he looked proper sneaky. Closed the door quick, like he didn't want nobody seeing." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Thank you, Tommy," she said. "You're doing splendidly. Keep watching, but don't let him know you're there." The boy grinned, delighted to be part of the mystery, and darted off, leaving Miss Marple to ponder his report. Grimsby's behaviour was increasingly suspicious, but she needed more than suspicion to act. The loose board, the speaker, the tapping all pointed to the shed as a focal point, but she could not investigate it openly without risking discovery. She decided to enlist the vicar, Mr. Clement, whose authority might grant her access to the shed under some pretext. She found him near the raffle stall, his face weary but kind as he counted tickets. "Miss Marple," he said, brightening, "enjoying the fête? Or are you caught up in this treasure nonsense like everyone else?" "A bit of both, perhaps," she replied, her tone light. "I was wondering, Mr. Clement, if you might allow a look inside the gardener's shed. I've a notion to see how Mr. Grimsby keeps those roses so splendid. It's for my own garden, you understand." The vicar chuckled, unsuspecting. "Of course," he said. "I'll have a word with Grimsby. Come by tomorrow morning and we'll sort it out." Miss Marple thanked him, her heart quickening. The shed, she was certain, held the next clue, and with it, a step closer to unravelling the manor's secrets as the sun dipped below the horizon. Casting the rose arch in shadow, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The speaker had been a clever trick, but the real mystery lay in the past, in the colonel's cryptic words and the shed's hidden board. She would tread carefully, for the puppeteer was still at large, watching from the shadows. But Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, was ready to meet them, her patience as steady as the roses that guarded the manor's secrets. Chapter 7. Suspects and Motives. The third day of the summer fête dawned bright and clear, with a crisp breeze sweeping through St. Mary's Mead, stirring the roses of Rosewood Manor into a gentle dance. The manor grounds hummed with activity. As villagers flocked to the stalls, their voices a lively chorus of barter and banter. But beneath the festive surface, the treasure rumour pulsed like a heartbeat, drawing curious glances toward the rose arch. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a wicker chair near the manor's ancient yew hedge, observed the crowd with her characteristic blend of quiet serenity and piercing insight. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, its contents untouched, for her mind was wholly occupied with the puzzle that had unfolded, the crushed petals, the hidden speaker, the nocturnal tapping, and the tantalizing hint of a rose-shed cache from Colonel Hargrove's records. Each clue pointed to a scheme, modern in its execution yet rooted in the manor's storied past, and Miss Marple was determined to identify the hand behind it. The discovery of the speaker, retrieved by young Tommy Clement from the Rose Arches vines, had been a revelation, confirming that someone was manipulating the treasure rumour with calculated precision. The device, with its cheap plastic casing and trailing wire, was a far cry from the Colonel's era of coded letters and hidden caches, suggesting a contemporary mind at work. Yet the library records, with their mention of a safeguarded legacy, had drawn Miss Marple's attention to the gardener's shed, where a loose board hinted at secrets yet to be uncovered. The contrast between the old and the new intrigued her, and she knew that to unravel the riddle, she must first understand the players in this village drama, their motives, their opportunities, and their secrets. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the crowd, her gaze lingering on the figures who had emerged as central to the mystery. There was Mrs. Pennyworth, the manor's housekeeper, whose flushed cheeks and anxious glances betrayed a desperation that went beyond her duties. The manor's crumbling state was no secret, its roof leaking and its walls in need of repair. And Miss Marple suspected that the promise of treasure might tempt Mrs. Pennyworth to fuel the rumour, hoping to draw wealthy visitors or secure funds for restoration. Yet her nervousness, particularly when questioned about the arch or the shed, suggested she might know more than she admitted, perhaps even playing a role in the scheme. Then there was Mr. Thomas Grimsby, the head gardener, whose evasive manner and protective stance over his shed had marked him as a figure of interest. His quick dismissal of the crushed petals, coupled with his unease when Miss Marple mentioned the loose board, pointed to a man guarding a secret. As the gardener, he had unparalleled access to the grounds, knowing every corner and crevice, and Miss Marple wondered if he had stumbled upon something perhaps the Colonel's cache and chosen to keep it hidden, using the speaker to divert attention to the arch. Finally, there was Mr. Clarence, the newcomer whose polished manners and incessant sketching of the Rose Arch raised questions about his true intentions. His claim to be a historian studying the manor's architecture was plausible, but his keen interest in the estate's value and his frequent presence near the arch suggested a deeper agenda. Miss Marple had seen him that morning, lingering near the manor's library, his notebook open as he jotted notes with a speed that belied casual curiosity. Was he searching for the treasure, or did he know something about its location? Perhaps through family ties to the Colonel or access to private documents. Miss Marple rose, her steps measured as she made her way toward the tea tent where the crowd was thickest. She moved with the unassuming grace of an elderly spinster, her lavender cardigan and sensible shoes blending seamlessly with the village scene. Yet her eyes missed nothing. At the tent, she accepted a cup of tea from a young maid, her smile disarming as she listened to the chatter around her. The treasure rumour had grown, with villagers speculating about gold coins, rare jewels, or even a lost deed to the manor itself. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts elsewhere. Gossip was a useful tool, but it often obscured the truth, and she preferred to rely on observation and deduction. She spotted Mrs. Pennyworth near the tent's entrance, her apron dusted with flour as she directed a pair of maids to replenish the scone tray. The housekeeper's face was drawn, her eyes darting toward the Rose Arch as if expecting some new development. Miss Marple approached, her tone warm and conversational. "Mrs. Pennyworth, you've outdone yourself this year," she said, gesturing to the bustling tent. "The Fête is a credit to the manor. But I imagine all this talk of treasure must be quite a distraction." Mrs. Pennyworth laughed, though it was a strained sound. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's a madness, isn't it? Everyone's got treasure fever, poking about the gardens like they expect to find gold under every bush. I wish they'd leave the roses alone." Her words were light, but her fingers twisted in her apron, a gesture Miss Marple noted with interest. "Have you seen anyone lingering near the arch?" she asked, her voice casual. "Or perhaps the shed? It's such a central spot for all this excitement." The housekeeper hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the shed before returning to Miss Marple. "Not really," she said, a touch too quickly. "Though Mr. Grimsby's always about, fussing over his plants, and that Mr. Clarency's been sketching again, always with that notebook of his. Makes you wonder what he's up to." She forced a smile and hurried off, muttering about a delivery of tea leaves, leaving Miss Marple to ponder her words. Mrs. Pennyworth's unease was palpable, and her mention of Clarence was telling. Was she deflecting suspicion, or did she genuinely suspect the newcomer? Miss Marple made her way toward the rose arch, where a small crowd had gathered, their voices a low hum of speculation. Mr. Hayworth, the butcher, was poking at the ground with a stick, much to the annoyance of Miss Finch, the schoolmistress, who stood nearby with her arms crossed. "You're ruining the path, George," she scolded. "If there's treasure, it's not under our feet." The note said petals, not dirt. Mr. Hayworth grunted, undeterred, and Miss Marple smiled faintly. The villagers' enthusiasm was predictable, but it served the schemer's purpose. Keeping eyes on the arch and away from other possibilities, she spotted Mr. Clarence at the edge of the group, his notebook open and his pencil moving swiftly as he sketched the trellis. His tailored suit and polished shoes stood out among the villagers' practical attire, and Miss Marple noted the intensity in his gaze, as if he was studying the arch for more than its architectural merits. She approached, her smile genial. "Mr. Clarence, your sketches must be quite a collection by now," she said. "The rose arch seems to hold a particular fascination for you." He looked up, his expression one of polite surprise, though his eyes held a guarded flicker. "Miss Marple," he said, closing his notebook with a snap, "you've caught me at it again. The arch is a fine example of Victorian craftsmanship, you know. I couldn't resist capturing its details." His smile was smooth, but Miss Marple's instincts prickled. His explanation was too practiced, and she wondered what his sketches truly depicted: structural details, or something more specific to the treasure. "Victorian craftsmanship is indeed charming," she said, her tone light, "though I wonder if the arch holds other secrets. This talk of treasure seems to have everyone intrigued, including historians." She watched him closely, noting the slight tightening of his jaw. "Oh, it's all nonsense, surely," he said, his laugh a touch forced. "Village legends, nothing more. I'm more interested in the manor's history than its myths." He tipped his hat and moved off, his steps brisk, and Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloguing his reaction. He was hiding something, she was certain, but whether it was knowledge of the treasure or involvement in the scheme remained to be seen. She turned her attention to the gardener's shed, visible in the distance, its door now open as Mr. Grimsby emerged with a pair of shears. He glanced toward the arch, his expression sour, and Miss Marple noted the way his hands tightened around the tool, as if bracing for an unwelcome task. She recalled Tommy's report of the gardener's sneaky behavior, and the loose board in the shed loomed large in her thoughts. Grimsby's access to the grounds made him a prime suspect, but his motive was unclear. Was he protecting a discovery, or had he planted the speaker to divert attention from his own activities? Miss Marple decided to visit the tea shop in the village, a hub of gossip where she might glean further insights. The shop, a cozy establishment with lace curtains and mismatched china, was crowded with fete-goers, their voices buzzing with talk of the treasure. She settled at a corner table, her tea steaming as she listened to the conversations around her. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, was holding court at a nearby table, her voice shrill with excitement. "I heard the colonel hit a fortune in gold. Coins," she declared. "And that note about the petals, it's a map, mark my words." Her audience nodded, enthralled, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere, piecing together the motives of her suspects. Mrs. Pennyworth's desperation to save the manor suggested she might see the treasure rumour as a means to an end, perhaps hoping to attract investors or tourists. Grimsby's guarded demeanour pointed to a man with something to hide, possibly a discovery in the shed that he wished to keep secret. Clarence, with his sketches and keen interest in the manor's value, might be after the treasure itself, perhaps armed with knowledge from private records. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning to the speaker. Its placement required technical skill, or at least access to such a device, which narrowed the field. Grimsby, with his practical knowledge, could manage it, but so could Clarence, whose polished exterior might conceal a knack for modern gadgets. As she left the tea shop, she spotted Tommy Clement racing toward her, his face alight with news. "Miss Marple," he whispered, pulling her aside. "I saw Mr. Clarence near the shed just now, looking at the window. He didn't go in, but he was writing something in his notebook, and Mr. Grimsby came out and shooed him off." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Well done, Tommy," she said. "You're proving quite the detective. Keep watching, but stay out of sight." The boy nodded, scampering off, and Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The suspects were circling, their motives becoming clearer, but the truth remained just out of reach. She returned to the manor, her thoughts on the shed and its loose board. The vicar had promised access tomorrow, and she intended to examine it closely, perhaps with Tommy's help. For now, she would watch and listen, her patience as steady as the roses that guarded the manor's secrets. The riddle under the rose. Arch was a tapestry of motives and misdirection, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, was ready to unravel it, one thread at a time. Chapter 8. The Shed's Secret. The twilight of the third day of the summer fete draped Rosewood Manor's gardens in a soft violet hush, the air heavy with the scent of roses and the distant murmur of lingering villagers. The stalls were being packed away, their colourful awnings folded into carts, and the laughter of children had faded, leaving only the occasional clink of teacups from the tea tent. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender cardigan drawn close against the evening chill, moved silently along the gravel path toward the gardener's shed, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The events of the past days, the crushed petals, the hidden speaker, the nocturnal tapping, and the tantalizing clues from Colonel Hargrove's records had woven a complex tapestry, and she sensed that the shed, with its loose board, held a pivotal thread. Tonight, under the cover of dusk, she intended to uncover its secret. The rose arch stood sentinel in the fading light, its crimson blooms now shadowed, their vibrancy muted to a deep, velvety hue. Miss Marple paused briefly to glance at it, her sharp eyes noting the absence of the wire and speaker safely stowed in her cottage after young Tommy Clement's discovery. The arch, she was certain, had been a distraction, a stage set to draw the village's attention while the true secret lay elsewhere. The shed, tucked just behind, was her focus now. its weathered oak walls and ivy-clad exterior concealing something that Mr. Grimsby, the gardener, seemed anxious to protect. His evasive manner, coupled with the loose board she had noticed, suggested a hiding place, perhaps tied to the rose-shed cache mentioned in the Colonel's records. Miss Marple had chosen this hour deliberately, when the Fate's bustle had subsided and the manor grounds were quiet. The vicar, Mr. Clement, had promised her access to the shed in the morning, but she could not wait. The urgency of the mystery, heightened by Mr. Clarence's persistent sketching and Mrs. Pennyworth's nervous glances, pressed upon her. She carried a small flashlight, borrowed from her nephew's old toolkit, its beam discreet but sufficient for her purpose. As she approached the shed, she moved with the unassuming grace of an elderly spinster, her steps silent on the grass to avoid drawing attention from any lingering groundskeepers or curious fete-goers. The shed's door was locked, as she had expected, the rusty padlock glinting faintly in the twilight. She circled to the back, where a small window offered a view of the cluttered interior spades, shears, and sacks of fertilizer piled haphazardly around a worn workbench. The loose board, visible through the glass, was her target, its edges worn smooth as if handled often. Miss Marple tested the window, finding it unlatched, and with a gentle push it creaked open. She hesitated, aware of the impropriety of entering without permission, but her curiosity and her conviction that the shed held the key to the riddle overrode her scruples. With a glance to ensure she was alone, she slipped inside, her movements slow but steady. The air within the shed was musty, tinged with the sharp scent of earth and linseed oil. She clicked on her flashlight, its beam cutting through the dimness to illuminate the workbench, strewn with seed packets and a pair of pruning shears. Her eyes, however, were drawn to the loose board on the back wall, its uneven fit betraying its purpose. She stepped closer, her heart quickening, and ran her fingers along its edge. It yielded easily, sliding aside with a faint groan to reveal a narrow cavity, no more than a foot deep. Inside, nestled against the rough wood, was a sealed tin, its edges rusted but intact, its surface etched with the faint outline of a rose. Miss Marple's breath caught as she lifted the tin, its weight suggesting something substantial within. She set it on the workbench, her gloved hands careful to avoid leaving marks, and pried open the lid with a small screwdriver from the bench. The hinges protested, but the tin opened to reveal a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age and sealed with a wax stamp bearing the Colonel's initials. She unfolded it carefully, her flashlight illuminating a hand-drawn map of the manor grounds. Its lines faded but precise. At its center was the rose arch, marked with a small X, but a second X, more prominent, was drawn near the shed itself, beneath a notation that read, "Beneath the heart of the rose." Her pulse quickened as she studied the map, its details, confirming the clues from the Colonel's letters. The treasure, if it existed, was not under the arch, but within the shed, hidden in a place only someone familiar with the Colonel's cryptic mind might find. The map was authentic, its paper and ink consistent with the Colonel's era, and Miss Marple felt a quiet thrill at the discovery. Yet the speaker, the crushed petals, and the tapping were modern additions, suggesting someone had revived the old legend for their own purposes, using the arch as a decoy to keep curious eyes away from the shed. She replaced the tin in its cavity, securing the board with care, and slipped out of the shed, closing the window behind her. The map's existence raised new questions. Who had known of it, and why stage such an elaborate ruse to distract from it? Mr. Grimsby, with his intimate knowledge of the grounds, was the obvious suspect, but his guarded demeanour seemed more protective than cunning. Mrs. Pennyworth, desperate to save the manor, might have learned of the map and spread the rumour to draw attention. Though her nervousness suggested fear rather than guile, Mr. Clarence, with his sketches and interest in the manor's value, remained a wild card. His polished exterior masking a motive Miss Marple had yet to discern as she made her way back to the main lawn. The manor loomed against the darkening sky, its windows aglow with the soft light of evening lamps. She spotted young Tommy Clement near the fountain, his cap askew as he tossed pebbles into the water. Miss Marple called, hurrying over. "I saw Mr. Grimsby coming back to the shed just now, looking all shifty. He didn't see me, though I hid behind the hedge." Miss Marple smiled, patting his shoulder. "You're a fine detective, Tommy," she said. "Did he go inside?" The boy nodded. "Aye, and he locked the door quick. Looked like he was checking something." Miss Marple's mind raced. Grimsby's return suggested he suspected someone had been near the shed, perhaps alerted by the open window or a misplaced tool. She resolved to confront him soon, but not tonight. Her discovery needed to remain secret until she could verify the map's significance. She sent Tommy home with a penny and a warning to stay quiet, then turned her attention to the manor, where Mrs. Pennyworth was overseeing the final clean-up of the tea tent. The housekeeper's movements were brisk, but her eyes darted toward the shed, as if drawn by an unseen thread. Miss Marple approached, her smile genial. "Mrs. Pennyworth, you must be exhausted," she said, her tone warm. "The fete has been a triumph, but all this treasure talk must be quite a burden." The housekeeper laughed, though her hands twisted in her apron. "It's a circus, Miss Marple," she said. "Everyone's asking about that note, and I've half a mind to dig up the arch myself." Her jest was light, but her eyes held a flicker of unease, and Miss Marple noted it, her mind cataloguing the housekeeper's behaviour alongside Grimsby's and Clarence's. "Has anyone been near the shed?" Miss Marple asked, her voice casual. "It's so close to the arch, I imagine it's drawn some attention." Mrs. Pennyworth hesitated, her fingers stilling. "Not that I've noticed," she said, "though Mr. Grimsby's always fussing about keeping folks away, and Mr. Clarence was there earlier, sketching again. Odd man, that one." She hurried off, her excuse about checking the kitchen unconvincing, and Miss Marple watched her go, her thoughts turning to Clarence. The historian had been a constant presence, his notebook a fixture at the arch, and now, apparently, the shed. She recalled Tommy's report of Clarence lingering near the shed's window, and she wondered what he sought. Was he after the map, or did he know of the shed's secret already? His interest in the manor's value, overheard at the tea shop, suggested a motive tied to profit, perhaps a plan to acquire the estate cheaply if the treasure rumour destabilized its ownership. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with him, perhaps under the guise of discussing the manor's history, to probe his intentions further. As she walked back to her cottage, the village was settling into the quiet of evening, the fates, lights dimming as the stars emerged. She sat by her window, the map's image vivid in her mind. The X beneath the shed suggested a hiding place, perhaps under a floorboard or behind another panel, and she resolved to investigate with the vicar's permission in the morning. For now, she kept the tin's discovery to herself, knowing that revealing it prematurely might alert the schemer behind the speaker and the tapping. The riddle under the rose arch was no longer just a village tale, it was a game of deception, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, was determined to play it to the end. Chapter 9. Confronting the gardener, the fourth morning of the summer fete dawned with a gentle mist over St. Mary's Mead, cloaking the gardens of Rosewood Manor in a delicate veil that softened the vibrant reds of the rose arch to a muted glow. The village was stirring, the air filled with the scent of dew-soaked grass and the distant clatter of stalls being set up for the day's festivities. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender cardigan buttoned against the early chill, sat at her cottage window, her knitting untouched as she reviewed the events of the previous evening. The discovery of the tin in the gardener's shed, containing a map marked with an X beneath the shed itself, had been a breakthrough, confirming that the treasure rumoured to be hidden on the manor grounds was no mere legend. Yet the modern elements, crushed petals, the hidden speaker, and the nocturnal tapping pointed to a contemporary scheme, one designed to manipulate the village's curiosity while concealing the true hiding place. Today, Miss Marple resolved to confront Mr. Thomas Grimsby, the gardener, whose evasive demeanour and proximity to the shed made him a central figure in the riddle. She had arranged to meet the vicar, Mr. Clement, at the manor to gain access to the shed, ostensibly to admire Grimsby's gardening techniques. But her true purpose was to gauge the gardener's reaction to her probing, to see if he would betray knowledge of the tin or the map. Grimsby's unease, observed during their earlier encounter, suggested he was guarding a secret, and Miss Marple suspected he might be the architect of the speaker's placement, using it to divert attention from the shed. Yet she remained cautious, aware that other players, Mrs. Pennyworth, with her desperate hope for the manor's salvation, and Mr. Clarence, with his persistent sketching, might also be involved. The riddle under the rose arch was a tapestry of motives, and she was determined to unravel it thread by thread. Miss Marple set out for the manor, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path as the mist began to lift, revealing the rose arch in all its splendour. The fete was quieter today, the initial frenzy of treasure talk tempered by a growing scepticism among some villagers, though others still lingered near the arch, poking at the ground with sticks or whispering about gold and jewels. She passed the tea tent, where Mrs. Pennyworth was directing a maid to arrange a tray of pastries, her face flushed with the strain of managing the event. Miss Marple offered a polite nod but did not stop, her focus fixed on the shed and the confrontation ahead. The gardener's shed stood as it had the previous evening, its weathered oak walls partially obscured by ivy and marigolds. The door was open, and through the gap, Miss Marple saw Grimsby sorting through a pile of gardening gloves, his wiry frame bent over the workbench. She approached, her smile genial but her eyes sharp. "Good morning, Mr. Grimsby," she called, pausing at the threshold. "I hope I'm not interrupting." The vicar suggested I might have a look at your shed. Your roses are so splendid. I thought I might learn a trick or two for my own garden. Grimsby looked up, his weathered face tightening for a moment before he forced a grunt of acknowledgement. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff. "Ain't much to see here, just tools and dirt." His hands moved restlessly, shoving the gloves into a drawer, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked toward the back wall, where the loose board concealed the tin. She stepped inside, her movements deliberate, and gestured toward the roses visible through the window. "Your work is remarkable," she said, "though I confess, all this talk of treasure has me curious. Those crushed petals under the arch, such a strange clue, don't you think?" Grimsby's fingers twitched, and he turned to a rack of spades, busying himself with their arrangement. "Kids, like I said," he muttered, "or fate folk, trampling things. Nothing to it." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the strain in his voice. the slight tremor in his hands. She stepped closer to the workbench, her eyes casually sweeping the room. "Perhaps," she said, "but I heard the oddest sound near the arch last night, a tapping, almost like a signal. And then there was that wire in the vines. It makes one wonder if someone's playing a clever game." The gardener froze, his hand gripping a spade, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might bolt. Then he turned, his eyes narrowing. "Don't. Know nothing about no tapping," he said, his voice low. "Nor wires. You'd best ask them as likes to meddle." But his gaze darted to the loose board, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. She had struck a nerve, and she pressed gently, her tone mild but probing. "I found something curious, Mr. Grimsby," she said, lowering her voice. "A speaker hidden in the arch. And I couldn't help but notice that board on your wall seems a bit loose, doesn't it? Almost as if it's hiding something." Grimsby's face paled, and he set the spade down with a clatter. "You've been poking about, have you?" he said, his voice a mix of anger and fear. "Ain't right, sneaking into a man's shed." Miss Marple held his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "I only seek the truth, Mr. Grimsby," she said, "and I think you know more about this treasure business than you're letting on. That speaker didn't place itself, and those petals were no accident. Why don't you tell me what's really going on?" For a long moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the distant hum of the Fête. Then Grimsby slumped, his shoulders sagging as if a weight had been lifted, or perhaps accepted. "All right," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean no harm, Miss Marple. It was me put that speaker up there, and the petals too. Thought it'd keep folks away from the shed, keep Em guessing about the arch." He paused, his eyes darting to the board. "I found that 10 years ago when I was fixing the wall. Didn't know what to make of it, but I kept it hidden. Thought I might sell the map someday, when times got tough. Then this Fête came, and folks started nosing about, so I stirred up the treasure talk to keep Em off my trail." Miss Marple nodded, her expression gentle but firm. "And the tapping?" she asked. "Your idea as well?" Grimsby nodded, his face flushed with shame. "Used the speaker to make it sound mysterious, like a code. Figured it'd keep people looking at the arch, not here. I never touched no treasure, Miss Marple, I swear. Just the map, and I didn't even know if it was real." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple saw the truth in his eyes, a man driven by fear and a small, desperate greed, not malice. "Thank you for being honest, Mr. Grimsby," she said, her tone kind. "But you must see that this can't go on. The map may lead to something real, and others are watching perhaps more than you realize. Will you trust me to handle this?" Discreetly, Grimsby hesitated, then nodded, his relief palpable. "I don't want trouble," he said. "Just want my roses left alone." Miss Marple smiled, patting his arm. "Then leave it to me," she said, "and perhaps keep that shed locked a bit tighter." She left the shed, her mind racing as she processed Grimsby's confession. The gardener had planted the speaker and the petals, confirming her suspicions about the modern elements of the scheme. But his motive was small a desire to protect his find, not to exploit it. The map, however, was another matter. Its authenticity suggested that Colonel Hargrove's treasure was real, hidden beneath the shed as the X indicated. Yet Grimsby's actions had drawn attention, and Miss Marple suspected others had caught wind of the secret. Mrs. Pennyworth's nervous glances and Mr. Clarence's persistent sketching pointed to deeper involvement, and she resolved to turn her attention to them as she rejoined the Fête. The manor grounds were alive with colour and sound, the Rose Arch a focal point for curious villagers. She spotted Mrs. Pennyworth near the tea tent, her apron askew as she fussed over a tray of sandwiches. The housekeeper's eyes darted toward the shed, and Miss Marple wondered if she had seen her emerge. She approached, her smile disarming. "Mrs. Pennyworth, you're a marvel," she said. "The Fête is thriving, despite all this treasure talk. Have you heard any new rumours?" The housekeeper laughed, though her hands trembled slightly. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's all anyone can talk about," she said. "I saw Mr. Clarence near the arch again, sketching like his life depended on it. Makes you wonder what he's after." Miss Marple noted the deflection, her mind cataloguing the housekeeper's unease. Mrs. Pennyworth's desperation to save the manor was a powerful motive, but her nervousness suggested fear of discovery, perhaps of her own role in spreading the rumour. Miss Marple made a mental note to watch her closely, perhaps through Tommy's sharp eyes. She moved on, her gaze sweeping the crowd for Mr. Clarence, who was nowhere to be seen. His absence was telling, and she suspected he was pursuing his own leads, perhaps aware of the shed's significance. She found Tommy near the fountain, tossing pebbles and watching the ripples. "Miss Marple," he called, bounding over. "I saw Mr. Clarence heading toward the manor library earlier, carrying a big book. Looked sneaky, he did." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Thank you, Tommy," she said. "You're doing splendidly. Keep an eye on him, but don't let him see you." The boy grinned, scampering off, and Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. Grimsby's confession had clarified one piece of the puzzle, but the larger picture remained elusive. The map pointed to the shed, but others were circling, their motives, tangled in greed, desperation, or ambition. She would need to tread carefully, for the riddle under the Rose Arch was nearing its climax, and Miss Marple was determined to be one step ahead. Chapter 10. The True Motive. The 5th day of the summer fête brought a vibrant energy to St. Mary's Mead, with the sun climbing high over Rosewood Manor, casting dappled light through the ancient yews and onto the Rose Arch's crimson blooms. The village buzzed with anticipation, the treasure rumour now a fever that gripped every conversation from the tea tent to the jam stall. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender cardigan neatly buttoned, moved through the crowd with the quiet grace of an elderly spinster, her knitting bag slung over her arm, but her mind far from idle. The events of the past days, the crushed petals, the hidden speaker, the nocturnal tapping, and the map found in the gardener's shed had woven a complex web, and Mr. Grimsby's confession had clarified one thread. He had planted the speaker and petals to divert attention from the shed where he had hidden the Colonel's map. Yet Miss Marple sensed that Grimsby was not the mastermind, merely a pawn in a larger scheme, and her attention now turned to Mr. Clarence, the historian whose persistent sketching and guarded manner suggested a deeper motive. Grimsby's admission had confirmed the map's authenticity, its X marking a spot beneath the shed as the likely hiding place of Colonel Hargrove's treasure. But the modern elements, the speaker, the tapping, the anonymous note pointed to someone else, someone with a broader agenda. Mrs. Pennyworth's nervous glances and desperate hope for the manor's salvation made her a suspect, but her anxiety seemed rooted in fear rather than cunning. Mr. Clarence, however, was a different matter. His polished exterior, his notebook filled with sketches of the Rose Arch, and his overheard conversations about the manor's value suggested a calculated interest, perhaps tied to acquiring the estate or its hidden fortune. Miss Marple resolved to confront him, but first she needed to observe him in his element. to gauge his true intentions. The fête was in full swing, with children darting through the crowd and villagers haggling over homemade pies and knitted scarves. Miss Marple settled onto a bench near the manor's fountain, her eyes scanning the grounds for Clarence. She spotted him near the Rose Arch. His tailored suit, a stark contrast to the villager's practical attire, his notebook open as he sketched, with a precision that belied his claim of casual interest. His posture was tense, his gaze flicking between the arch and the shed, as if measuring their proximity. Miss Marple noted the way his pencil paused, his eyes narrowing, and she suspected he was searching for something specific, perhaps the map or a clue to its location. She rose, her steps measured, and approached the tea tent, where Mrs. Pennyworth was overseeing a tray of scones, her face flushed with the day's exertions. "Mrs. Pennyworth, you're a marvel," Miss Marple said, her smile warm. "The fête is thriving, despite all this treasure talk. Have you seen Mr. Clarence about? He seems quite taken with the Rose Arch." The housekeeper's eyes darted toward the arch, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Oh, he's always sketching," she said, her voice tight. "Never seen a man so fond of a trellis. Makes you wonder what he's really after." Her fingers twisted in her apron, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, sensing that Mrs. Pennyworth's anxiety went beyond the strain of the fête. "Thank you, Mrs. Pennyworth," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "I'll have a word with him myself. Historians can be such curious folk." She moved off, her mind cataloguing the housekeeper's reaction. Mrs. Pennyworth's fear suggested she knew something, perhaps about the map or the shed, but her role seemed secondary, a bystander caught in the web of someone else's scheme. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Clarence, whose presence at the arch and the shed had become too frequent to be coincidental. She found him at the edge of the lawn, his notebook closed but his eyes fixed on the shed, where Mr. Grimsby was pruning. A hedge with a distracted air. Miss Marple approached, her smile disarming. "Mr. Clarence, your sketches must be quite a collection by now," she said, her voice light. "The Rose Arch is lovely, but I wonder if it's the manor's history that truly draws you." Clarence turned, his expression one of polite surprise, though his eyes held a guarded flicker. "Miss Marple," he said, his smile smooth. "You're observant, aren't you? Yes, the manor's history is fascinating. Victorian architecture, old families, that sort of thing. The arch is just a charming detail." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes meeting his. "Charming, indeed," she said, "though I heard the oddest sound near it the other night, a tapping, like a signal. And then there was that curious note about crushed petals. It makes one wonder if someone's stirring up old legends for a purpose." She paused, watching his reaction. Clarence's smile faltered, his fingers tightening around his notebook. "Village gossip, surely," he said, his laugh a touch forced. "I'm more interested in facts than rumors. The manor's past is rich enough without buried treasure." His deflection was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the tension in his posture, the way his eyes darted toward the shed. She pressed gently, her tone conversational. "I found a map, you see," she said, lowering her voice. "Quite old, hidden in the shed. It points to something beneath the floor, near where you've been sketching. Curious, don't you think?" Clarence's face paled, his hand gripping the notebook as if to anchor himself. For a moment, she thought he might deny it, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of alarm, quickly masked. "A map," he said, his voice steady but strained. "That's intriguing, Miss Marple, but I'm sure it's just another village tale. I must be off research to do, you know." He tipped his hat and hurried away, his steps brisk, leaving Miss Marple to ponder his reaction. The encounter confirmed her suspicions. Clarence knew more than he admitted, perhaps about the map or the treasure itself. His interest in the manor's value, overheard at the tea shop, suggested a motive tied to profit, perhaps a plan to acquire the estate cheaply by fueling the treasure rumor, destabilizing its ownership. She recalled Tommy's report of Clarence lingering near the shed's window, and she wondered if he had seen the loose board or suspected its contents. His sketches, she suspected, were not of the arch's architecture, but of its relation to the shed, a blueprint for his own search. Miss Marple returned to the fountain, her thoughts racing. Grimsby's confession had clarified the speaker's role, but Clarence's behavior pointed to a larger scheme. She needed to confirm the map's significance, to see if the X beneath the shed led to the treasure itself. She sought out the vicar, Mr. Clement, who was near the raffle stall, counting tickets with a weary smile. "Mr. Clement," she said, her tone warm, "I wonder if we might have that look at the shed now. I'm so curious about Mr. Grimsby's methods, and I'd hate to trouble him when he's busy." The vicar, unsuspecting, nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple," he said. "Let's go now. I'll fetch the key." They made their way to the shed, where Grimsby was still pruning, his face tightening as he saw them approach. "Miss Marple wants a look inside," Mr. Clement said, his tone cheerful. "Show her your gardening secrets, Grimsby." The gardener grunted, unlocking the door with a reluctant air, and Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes immediately seeking the loose board. She kept her movements casual, admiring the tools and seed packets while the vicar chatted with Grimsby. Her flashlight, tucked in her pocket, was unnecessary in the daylight, but she noted the board's position, its edges still worn. She did not touch it, knowing Grimsby was watching, but she resolved to return later, perhaps with Tommy's help, to examine the floor beneath the map's X. For now, she thanked the vicar and Grimsby, her smile disarming, and left the shed, her mind turning to the Fate's final event, a garden auction, where manor artifacts would be sold to raise funds. The auction was held on the main lawn, with villagers gathered around a makeshift platform where Mrs. Pennyworth displayed items: a silver candlestick, a porcelain vase, and a rosewood box said to have belonged to Colonel Hargrove. Miss Marple watched from the edge of the crowd, her eyes on Clarence, who stood near the front, his notebook tucked away but his expression intent. When the rosewood box was announced, his hand shot up, bidding aggressively against a local antiques dealer. The box, intricately carved with rose motifs, fetched a high price, and Clarence's triumph was evident as he claimed it, his fingers lingering on its surface. Miss Marple approached him after the auction, her tone light. "A fine purchase, Mr. Clarence," she said. "That box must have a story to tell." He smiled, but his eyes were wary. "Just a piece of history," he said. "I collect such things." He moved off quickly, clutching the box, and Miss Marple's instincts prickled. The box, she suspected, was more than a keepsake, perhaps a clue to the treasure, or a container for something related to the map. She sought out Tommy, who was tossing pebbles near the fountain. "Miss Marple," he said, bounding over, "I saw Mr. Clarence open that box after the auction. Looked like he was checking inside, but he closed it quick when he saw me." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling. "You're a marvel, Tommy," she said. "Keep watching him, but stay out of sight." The boy grinned, scampering off, and Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. Clarence's interest in the box, coupled with his reaction to the map, suggested he was closer to the treasure than she had realized. His motive, she suspected, was to claim the fortune before the manor changed hands, perhaps by stirring the rumor to pressure the trustees into a quick sale. Thus the Fête wound down. Miss Marple sat by the fountain, her thoughts on the shed and the map. The true motive was becoming clear. Clarence was not just a historian, but a hunter, using the treasure rumor to his advantage. Yet Mrs. Pennyworth's fear and Grimsby's confession hinted at other layers, and Miss Marple knew she must act quickly to secure the map's secret. The riddle under the rose arch was nearing its resolution, and she was determined to unmask the puppeteer before they could claim their prize. Chapter 11. The treasure revealed. The final morning of the summer fête broke over St. Mary's Mead with a gentle warmth, the sun filtering through a thin veil of clouds to cast a soft glow over Rosewood Manor's gardens. The rose arch stood, resplendent, its crimson blooms catching the light like jewels, though the fervour of the treasure rumour had begun to wane among the villagers, replaced by a weary scepticism as no gold or gems had surfaced. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender cardigan buttoned against the morning breeze, moved through the manor grounds with her characteristic quiet purpose, her knitting bag slung over her arm. The events of the past days, the crushed petals, the hidden speaker, the nocturnal tapping, the map in the gardener's shed, and Mr. Grimsby's confession had brought her close to unravelling the riddle. Yet the true motive, she suspected, lay with Mr. Clarence, whose aggressive bidding for the rosewood box and guarded reaction to the map suggested. He was not merely a historian, but a hunter with designs on the Colonel's fortune. Grimsby's admission had clarified the modern elements of the scheme. The speaker and petals were his doing, a clumsy attempt to divert attention from the shed where he had hidden the map. But the map itself, with its X marking a spot beneath the shed, pointed to a genuine treasure, a legacy of Colonel Hargrove's secretive nature. Miss Marple's confrontation with Clarence at the auction had confirmed her suspicions. His interest in the manor's value and his swift acquisition of the rosewood box hinted at knowledge of the treasure's location, perhaps gained through private records or a family connection. Today, she resolved to secure the treasure before Clarence could act, ensuring it served the manor's future rather than his ambitions. She sought out the vicar, Mr. Clement, near the raffle stall where he was tallying the Fête's earnings, with a weary but satisfied air. "Mr. Clement," she said, her smile warm, "I wonder if we might have another look at the gardener's shed. I've a notion there's something beneath it that might settle this treasure talk once and for all." The vicar raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "You've been sleuthing, haven't you, Miss Marple?" he said, chuckling. "Very well, let's fetch Grimsby and see what's what. But I warn you, he's been prickly about that shed." They made their way to the shed, where Grimsby was sweeping the path, his face set in a scowl. He stiffened at their approach, his eyes darting to Miss Marple with a mix of resignation and wariness. "Miss Marple again," he muttered, setting his broom aside. "What now?" The vicar clapped him on the shoulder, his tone genial. "Just a quick look inside, Grimsby. Miss Marple thinks there's something to find, and I'm inclined to trust her instincts." Grimsby grunted, unlocking the door with a reluctant air, and Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes immediately seeking the loose board on the back wall. The shed was as cluttered as before, its air thick with the scent of earth and linseed oil. Miss Marple moved to the workbench, her movements casual to avoid alarming Grimsby, and gestured to the floor beneath it. "I believe there's something under here," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The map I found last night marked a spot right beneath this shed." Shall we have a look? Grimsby's face paled, but he nodded, his earlier confession stripping him of defiance. The vicar, intrigued, fetched a crowbar from the tool rack, and together they pried up a floorboard near the workbench, revealing a small, dirt-packed cavity. Miss Marple knelt, her flashlight illuminating the space. There, nestled in the earth, was a metal chest, its surface tarnished but intact, its lock engraved with the same rose motif as the tin. Her heart quickened as she lifted it out, its weight confirming its significance. The vicar's eyes widened, and even Grimsby let out a low whistle. "Blimey," he muttered. "Is that it, then?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "I believe so," she said. "But let's open it discreetly, Mr. Clement. No need to fuel more rumors just yet." They carried the chest to the manor's library, a quiet room lined with dusty tomes and faded portraits, where Mrs. Pennyworth joined them, her face a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple used a small tool from the shed to pry open the lock, revealing a trove of gold coins and a single ruby brooch, its facets catching the light like a captured star. The vicar gasped, and Mrs. Pennyworth's hands flew to her mouth. "It's real," she whispered. "The Colonel's treasure." Grimsby stood silent, his eyes fixed on the chest, and Miss Marple noted his relief, as if a burden had been lifted. "This must be handled carefully," she said, her tone firm. "The manor's trustees should decide its use, perhaps to restore the gardens and roof, but we must keep it quiet for now, to avoid a frenzy." The vicar nodded, his face grave. "You're right, Miss Marple. I'll speak to the trustees at once. But how did you know?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "A matter of observation, Mr. Clement, and a bit of patience." As they secured the chest in the manor's safe, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Clarence. His absence at the shed was telling, and she suspected he was biding his time, perhaps waiting for an opportunity to search the shed himself. She sought out young Tommy Clement, who was tossing pebbles near the fountain, his cap askew. "Tommy," she said, her voice low, "have you seen Mr. Clarence today?" The boy nodded, his eyes bright. "He was near the library earlier, Miss Marple, looking at that rosewood box he bought. Kept opening and closing it, like he was checking for something. Inside—" Miss Marple's instincts prickled. The box, with its rose motif, might hold a clue to the treasure's location, perhaps a duplicate map or a key. She made her way to the auction area, where the last items were being cleared away, and found Clarence sitting on a bench, the rosewood box in his lap. His face was tense, his fingers tracing the carvings as if searching for a hidden catch. She approached, her smile disarming. "Mr. Clarence, that box is quite a treasure in itself," she said. "Have you found anything interesting inside?" Clarence started, his hands tightening around the box. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but strained, "just admiring my purchase. It's a fine piece, likely from the Colonel's time." His eyes darted to the manor, and Miss Marple pressed gently, her tone conversational. "I've found something myself," she said, lowering her voice. "A chest, hidden beneath the shed, just as the map suggested. It seems the treasure is real, but I wonder who else knew of it and why they stirred such a fuss." Clarence's face paled, his fingers gripping the box. For a moment, he seemed poised to deny everything, but Miss Marple's steady gaze held him. "I see," he said finally, his voice low. "You're cleverer than I thought, Miss Marple. Yes, I knew about the Treasure family papers. You see, my great-uncle was a friend of the Colonel's, and his letters mentioned a hidden fortune. I came here to find it, to claim it before the manor was sold. The rumour, the note I spread them to pressure the trustees, make them think the estate was troubled. A quick sale, and I'd have the grounds to myself. Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm but unyielding. And the box? She asked. Clarence hesitated, then opened it, revealing a small, folded paper sketch of the shed, with an X matching the maps. A copy, he admitted. I found it in the family archives. I thought it might lead me to the treasure, but you've beaten me to it. His shoulders slumped, and Miss Marple saw the defeat in his eyes. A man whose ambitions had outrun his cunning. You've caused quite a stir. Mr. Clarence, she said, her tone gentle but firm. But the treasure will serve the manor, not private greed. I suggest you leave St. Mary's Mead quietly, before the trustees hear of your scheme. Clarence nodded, his face ashen, and gathered his things, the rosewood box tucked under his arm. Miss Marple watched him go, her heart steady. The treasure was secure, and the manor's future brighter for it. As the fete drew to a close, Miss Marple sat by the fountain, her knitting resumed at last. The rose arch stood quiet, its secrets laid bare, and she felt a quiet satisfaction. The riddle had been solved, not by grand gestures, but by the patient observation of human nature, a skill she had honed over years in a village that never ceased to surprise. She smiled, her needles clicking, and turned her thoughts to the next puzzle, for in St. Mary's Mead there was always another waiting. Chapter 12. The Rose Arch Restored. The final day of the summer fete drew to a close over St. Mary's Mead. The sun sinking behind Rosewood Manor's ancient yews, casting long golden shadows across the gardens. The rose arch stood in the fading light, its crimson blooms unmarred by the earlier frenzy of treasure-seekers, their petals now intact and vibrant, as if the manor itself had exhaled a sigh of relief. The air was filled with the lingering sense of homemade jam and fresh-cut grass, and the last strains of a village quartet's melody drifted from the main lawn, where villagers gathered for the fate's closing ceremony. Miss Jane Marple, seated once more beneath the sturdy oak that had been her vantage point throughout the week, held her knitting needles with a steady rhythm, their soft clicks a counterpoint to the hum of conversation. Her lavender cardigan was neatly buttoned, her knitting bag at her feet, but her sharp eyes roamed the scene, missing nothing of the quiet triumph that marked the resolution of the riddle under the rose arch, the discovery of Colonel Hargrove's treasure. A chest of gold coins and a ruby brooch hidden beneath the gardener's shed had been a victory, not for personal gain but for the manor's future. Miss Marple had ensured its secrecy, sharing the find only with the vicar, Mr. Clement, and the manor's trustees, who had agreed to use the fortune to restore the estate's crumbling walls and leaking roof. The schemer, Mr. Clarence, had been unmasked, his plan to stir the treasure rumour and pressure the trustees into a cheap sale thwarted by Miss Marple's quiet persistence. His departure from the village, rosewood box in hand and notebook abandoned, had been a silent admission of defeat, leaving the manor and its gardens to reclaim their peaceful dignity. Miss Marple's thoughts, as she sat beneath the oak, were not on her victory, but on the delicate threads of human nature that had woven the mystery. The crushed petals, the hidden speaker, the nocturnal tapping all had been Mr. Grimsby's clumsy attempt to protect the map he had found, a map that pointed to the true treasure. Yet it was Clarence's cunning that had set the stage. His anonymous note and whispered rumours designed to destabilize the manor's ownership. Mrs. Pennyworth, with her anxious hope for the manor's salvation, had been a bystander, caught in the web of others' schemes, her fear a reflection of her loyalty rather than complicity. Each player had revealed something of themselves, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for such revelations, had pieced their motives together like a pattern in her knitting. The closing ceremony began, drawing her attention to the main lawn, where the vicar stood on a small platform, his face alight with gratitude as he addressed the crowd. "My dear friends," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs, "this year's fête has been a triumph, not only for our community, but for Rosewood Manor itself. Thanks to a generous, and shall we say, fortuitous discovery, we can ensure the manor's gardens and halls will stand for generations to come." The villagers cheered, though few knew the full story, and Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles pausing. The vicar had kept her role quiet, as she preferred, but his glance in her direction held a warmth that acknowledged her part. Mrs. Pennyworth stood near the platform, her apron finally free of flour, her face radiant with relief. Miss Marple had spoken with her earlier, gently reassuring her that the manor's future was secure. "Oh, Miss Marple," the housekeeper had said, her eyes brimming, "I thought we'd lose this place, but you've worked a miracle." Miss Marple had demurred, her tone modest. "No miracle, Mrs. Pennyworth, just a matter of listening to what people don't say." The housekeeper's gratitude had been heartfelt, and Miss Marple noted the lightness in her step now, a stark contrast to the nervous glances of days past. Young Tommy Clement darted through the crowd, his cap askew as he waved to Miss Marple. "Did we do it, Miss Marple?" he whispered, sidling up to her bench. "Did we save the treasure?" She chuckled, patting his shoulder. "We did, Tommy," she said, her voice low. "And you were a splendid detective. But let's keep it our secret, shall we?" The boy grinned, his chest puffed with pride, and scampered off to join his friends, leaving Miss Marple to reflect on his invaluable help. His sharp eyes and nimble fingers had uncovered the speaker, and his reports of Clarence's movements had guided her to the truth. The rose arch, now free of its stage distractions, stood as a symbol of the manor's enduring beauty. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it, her thoughts turning to the map and the chest it had revealed. The colonel's treasure, hidden beneath the shed's floor, had been a testament to his secretive nature, a fortune safeguarded not by locks but by clever misdirection. The map's X, the rose shed cache, had been the key, and Miss Marple's discovery of it had thwarted Clarence's scheme. She wondered briefly about the rosewood box, which Clarence had clutched so tightly as he left. Had it held another clue? Or was it merely a memento of his failed ambition? She suspected the latter, for the box's carvings matched the chest's motif, but it contained only a sketch, a shadow of the map she had found. As the ceremony continued, Miss Marple's mind drifted to the villagers who had played their parts in the drama. Mr. Grimsby, now pruning a hedge near the arch, seemed lighter, his confession lifting a burden he had carried for years. She had advised him to keep the shed locked, and his nod had been one of gratitude, a silent promise to leave scheming behind. Mrs. Pennyworth, bustling among the crowd, was already planning repairs, her hope for the manor restored. Even Miss Finch, the schoolmistress, who had scolded treasure hunters for ruining the paths, stood smiling, her usual severity softened by the fête's success. The crowd began to disperse, villagers drifting toward their cottages as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Miss Marple remained beneath the oak, her knitting resumed, the rhythmic click of her needles a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts. The riddle under the rose arch had been a study in human nature, greed, desperation, and ambition woven together in a delicate pattern. Clarence had sought to exploit the manor's vulnerability, using the treasure rumour to force a sale. But his plan had underestimated the quiet vigilance of a village spinster. Grimsby's small greed had led him to plant the speaker, but his fear of discovery had made him an unlikely ally. Mrs. Pennyworth's loyalty, though tinged with anxiety, had kept her from crossing into deceit. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the approach of Miss Hartnell, the librarian, her pince-nez glinting as she settled onto the bench beside her. "Miss Marple, you've done it again," she said, her voice low but admiring. "The vicar let slip that you had a hand in this treasure business. Care to share the tale?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles never pausing. "It's only a matter of listening, Miss Hartnell," she said. "People reveal themselves if you know where to look." The librarian chuckled, shaking her head. "You're a marvel, Jane. The village would be dull without you." As Miss Hartnell moved off, Miss Marple's gaze returned to the rose arch, its silhouette stark against the twilight. The manor's secrets had been laid bare, not by grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but by the patient observation of an elderly woman who understood the subtleties of village life. The treasure would restore the manor, its gardens and holes preserved for future fates, and the rose arch would stand as a testament to its enduring beauty. Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction, not in the praise that might come, but in the knowledge that she had served the truth. As she always did, the village clock struck 7, its chimes rolling softly across the grounds, and Miss Marple gathered her things, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag. She rose, her steps steady as she made her way home, the path lit by the first stars. The riddle under the rose arch was solved, its threads untangled, but St. Mary's Mead, she knew, would always hold new mysteries, waiting for her keen eyes and patient heart. As she passed the arch one last time, its roses glowing faintly in the dusk, she smiled, her thoughts already turning to the next puzzle. For in a village as lively as this, there was always another story to unravel.